Curitiba, Brazil, or I'm a missionary to Pinhais, Brazil, because there's no way I can reach Brazil. But together we can at least have a part in some area of Brazil what God is doing. And thank you for being faithful. We have a little slide presentation. It gives you an idea of what we've been doing the last several years. We were 20 years in Sorocaba planting churches, and we were involved in a team church plant. Our team planted 4 churches. For the last 18 years, we've been in Curitiba, and I've been the director of the Bible College and teaching. We've also just started a new church plant about a year and a half ago, and we're excited about that. And so this will bring you up to date on what we're doing.
But they don't come without prayer work, interceding for missionaries, financial support from local churches, hard work by missionaries, and dependence on the goodness and grace of God. In 2019, we put up for sale an
Looks like I didn't put that on right. So that gives you a little better idea of what we've been doing over the last several years. This presentation was made in January of last year, so giving you an update that 50-year-old layman who came to study with us did graduate and has already been called to a church. And so we're grateful for our graduates this year. We had that couple. Another couple has gone back to Sorocaba to work in their home church as an assistant pastor for a couple of years, get more ministry experience. And the two single young ladies that graduated this year will be going back, one to her home church where her dad is the pastor and would like to work in missions in that area of Brazil, in Manaus. And then another single young lady, a couple that helped her through school, she's considering working with them in southern Brazil. In our new church work, it's going rather slowly. As a church planter, which is what I did full-time for many years, it's a little frustrating because I can't give myself full-time to that. But because the church is about 30, 35 minutes away, and it takes a while to get out there and back. And so we're usually only out there on Saturdays and Sundays, visiting, making contacts, and then having our services. So it's going a little bit slowly, but God has allowed us to reach some families. We reached a Venezuelan family who I believe were saved, or at least understood salvation. But after I studied with them, I think they got real assurance of salvation. 3 lovely daughters, and then his mother and sister came, and they're now involved in our discipleship study. And since I've been gone since December, another cousin has come from Venezuela. So we're excited about that family and some others that we reach. We have gone around the barrio, and made contacts. So we have a list of about 50 people that we've made contacts that we're praying for. And we'd ask you to pray with us. Maybe some of you have a question about our ministry, what we're doing, about Brazil. Now's your opportunity. It's a little more rural. It's about, I'm going to say 20, 30,000 and what I would call close to town, but they're probably maybe 40 to 50,000 because it's a large metropolitan. Brazil's kind of divided into metropolitan areas. So a city will often have a lot of country around it too that they're responsible for. So I would say wider, it's probably 50,000. I'm sorry? Of our kind of church, yes. I mean, Brazil is very religious, so there are a lot of churches there. But our kind of a church, yes. Curitiba is the main city, and it's about 1.5 million. Metropolitan population is about 2.5 million. We're actually in one border city, which is called Pinhais, but this is another city called Campina Grande do Sul. And that not even anywhere close does it have a work like ours. And so, yes, it's the first church in that area. We have about 8 or 9 churches that our missionaries have started over the years in what they call Grand Curitiba. Someone else? Yes. Brazilians are about 75% Roman Catholic. So that's not negative for us because most of them aren't practicing, but they do know something about Jesus and about sin. So they're a little easier, I think, for the most part, to be open to the gospel, understand that they're sinners, that they need something, they need forgiveness. I would say a much greater obstacle are the other evangelical groups or the cults. All the cults you can think of there are there, and a few more. And then there are also a whole bunch of splits off of the Pentecostal, the Charismatic, and the Health and Wealth and Success Gospel. There's one Health, Wealth, Success Gospel church that has a bank. They own a bank because they didn't have a place to put all their money. So they bought a bank. And they really make it hard on us because people think all churches are after money. So I would say those kind of things are much more of an obstacle, or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, than Catholics in general, because they're a little more open to our teaching. Someone else? More students. The Bible College only had 15 students last year. That's kind of low for us. The average over the 18 years I've been there would be closer to 30. We've had as high as 40, but this is the lowest we've been in a long time. Post-COVID didn't help us. Brazil's economy is not doing really great right now, so there's several factors there, but the need is for students. We can make it work. Lord has always supplied for us. We've never had to go in the red. But it's kind of close. We do have funds from the sale of that property. We're using those, but we're going to keep some of that for emergencies, but most of that we're going to spend on renewing the campus. Some of our buildings are 40 years old, so putting new roofs on and all those kind of things. What the need is for a larger student body. If we're ever going to give this over to the Nationals and it to run, we need to have between 25 and 30 students normally, and we can hold on campus about 80 students. Oliver, Brazil. We offer a day program. You study in the morning, work and study in the afternoon and at night. Most Bible colleges and seminaries are at night. So we were founded on purpose by Baptist Missions missionaries because they felt like their students were not benefiting as much when they had to study in the evenings. Some people do really well in the evening, some people do terribly. They didn't have time to get their homework done and all those things, so they wanted to start a day school. So among fundamentalist conservative churches, we're one of the few who have a day program where they actually come, they live on campus, they go to class in the morning, and then they can work in the afternoons and study at night. So because of that, people who come to us are coming because they want that. We're a little more disciplined program. There's a campus, we eat meals together, like a lot of American Bible colleges. So that's kind of who we are. And that draws people from every part of the country. Someone else? Yes, ma'am. All of our staff, except the 4 Americans who are left, get a partial salary. They're all pastors or pastors' wives, so they already have a salary from their church. This is kind of just a supplement to their salary. It might be a third of their income, something like that, but we do pay them. But it is a labor of love, because if you're not going to get rich with what we pay them, but we feel like the labor is worthy of his hire, so we've always worked on that model. Someone else? Yes, no. It does the opposite. When their economy is down, the dollar goes up. Anybody who has money invested in dollars, or dollar type investments, so it's good for us, bad for them. So there's always been this, when the dollar goes up, it's like, yeah, we can do more, buy more things, but it's bad for our people. Someone over here. Yes, sir.
Different countries have a problem with
Translating?
different countries.
Brazil is the largest country in South America, and it also is, Portuguese is the most spoken language in Latin America, because Brazil is larger than all the rest of the countries that speak Spanish put together. So in all of Brazil, Portuguese is spoken, even in most of the tribal areas. So that's not a problem for us. At the borders, they speak Portanhol, which is Portuguese and Spanish together. But our borders are really widely spread out. We're as big as the continental U.S., essentially. So very large country, but pretty uniformly speaking Portuguese, except in very primitive tribal areas. My wife wants me to mention my health needs. Both of us had a little bit of a tough year. I've had a back problem, a disc problem for 20 years, since 2004, and I even had back problems as a teenager. To shorten a long story, I blew out a disc in July, and that put me flat on my back. Didn't have surgery. I had a shot basically to help with the pain, and I started pretty rigid physical therapy, stretching and all those things. So I couldn't walk at that time. Now I'm walking. You can see I come up the stairs. I fall down once in a while. But the Lord has given grace, and the shot is basically all worn off now. It's been about 7 months, and I can feel more pain, but the Lord has given grace for that, and I'm going to keep exercising, and I'm trying to avoid surgery. If I have to do it, I will, but I would just assume not. So that's just me. But I appreciate your prayers for health and strength. Jan had a stroke in probably May. Another long story shortened, when this episode happened to her, for about 20 minutes, she couldn't read music or on her phone. It was just, she couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense to her. And then it quit, and she just kept going, and like you do in life and ministry, and didn't think any more about it. She read an article by a friend on Facebook who had gone through something like that, and she'd had a stroke. So I took her to my neurologist, and he ran all the tests, and he said, you had a stroke, and it wasn't a mini stroke, it wasn't a TIA, it was actually a stroke, because you have a scar in your brain. But it was in an area that doesn't affect anything. Well, there's few areas in the center of your brain that we don't know what it could affect. So she's doing fine, but the doctor wanted her to cut back a little bit on some fats and cholesterol and other things, just to try to monitor that a little bit. But thankfully, she's doing fine. If she hadn't gone to the doctor, she probably would never have known that she had a stroke. But we'd appreciate your prayers for our health and strength. Yes, ma'am. Yes. My wife, Jan. My daughter, Kristen, and son-in-law, David. And my grandsons, Lucas and Alex. And I think they've been coming for the last few weeks here. So we're grateful that they're here. Someone else, real quickly. Don't tell him. I have to give him credit, or he'll charge me. All in the family. All right, well, do pray for us. Pray for our enrollment. We're starting about a little less than a month. We'll be going back on the 11th, just a week and a half from now. And then school will start the very last couple of days of February. We'll have our matricula, and then we'll have classes starting in March. So there are young people still deciding. Pray that God will give us a good number of young people. And then pray for health and strength and wisdom to keep going and doing what God has called us to do. Thanks so much.
So before we come back to share with us the word of God, go ahead and stand and listen our last song, All
Romans chapter 1. Paul said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. When I was a teenager, I said that this was my life verse. And I memorized it, and I quoted it to myself, and I said, this is what my life is about. But as I've grown older, I feel very convicted by this verse. Because if the gospel truly is the manifestation of God's power, why don't I witness more? Why am I not more bold? Why am I sometimes afraid to speak to some people? We said, well, you're a missionary. You're not afraid to speak to people. Of course I am. I'm a sinner. My wife's not, but I am. And often, we forget that it's the power of God. Paul uses the term gospel more times in Romans than any of his other epistles. And he calls it the gospel 3 times, gospel of God 2 times, the gospel of his Son once, my gospel once, and the gospel of Christ twice. So it makes sense that Paul uses the gospel frequently in Romans, because Romans 1-8 is basically an exposition of the gospel. Condemnation, justification, sanctification, adoption, glorification. And then chapters 9-11, the restoration of Israel. So in verse 16, Paul gives us, I think, the key to this book. And he goes on to say, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Paul is answering the implicit question, how can a person be just or righteous before God? How can we be right with God? Chapters 1 and 2 and some of 3 make clear that there's nothing that a person can do himself to be justified, to be right with God, to be accepted by God, to be considered righteous. Then in part of chapter 3 through chapter 5, he teaches that human beings can only be justified, made right with God, by faith in what God has done for us, not in what we have done for him. And that lines up perfectly with verse 17. Those who are righteous arrive at righteousness by faith, not by what they do, not by what they can do for God, but by accepting what God has done for us. The righteousness that we can have in Jesus Christ, by being in him. In fact, Paul says he was separated unto the gospel of God. He was set apart. This is set apart for a special purpose. And that purpose is the good news, the gospel that comes from God or that belongs to God. One of the things I see in a country that is Catholic, now most Brazilians aren't practicing Catholics, but one of the things I often see is that Mary is exalted almost above Jesus. And I remember seeing a bumper sticker one time that said, everything through the Son, but nothing without his mother. Somebody actually had that on the back of their car. And I thought, that really sums it up. The idea is God is kind of angry at sin, hard to deal with. You know, an old man with a gray beard. I'm not talking about Pastor. I have more gray hair than he does, so I can't. But, we have that image in our minds, and then that Jesus is a little bit like that, but Mary is the one, who can really connect with Jesus and God. And she becomes a redemptrix. Some of the church doctrine says she's actually part of your redemption. But the New Testament teaches that the gospel is the gospel of God. God so loved the world. Did Jesus love us? Absolutely. But not before God loved us. In the Trinity, it was decided in eternity for the Father to sacrifice the Son. And so God is the author of the gospel. And of course, you can say it's the gospel of the Son. You can say it's the gospel of the Spirit. And Paul uses those terms in different ways. But the point is that this is the gospel of God to which Paul was separated. The message that God came to him with completely flipped his life upside down. Because Paul was living for what he could do for God. And when he realized it was what God had done for him, it completely transformed his life and his vision and his ministry. And he gave all he had to serving that God. And he says that gospel is the power of God. The word is dunamis, used 120 times in the New Testament. It's the word from which we get dynamite. When I was young, I would preach saying, the gospel is the dynamite of God. But that's not really good exegesis because dynamite was only invented in 1890s. So it just meant power or authority. So the emphasis is not on the power of God, but it's on the power of God. It's God kind of power, which is what? Infinite, without limits. God's power and authority are absolutely without limitations. There's nothing that limits God. And Paul is saying that's what we have at our disposal. The absolute authority and power of God when we speak, when we preach, when we tell the gospel. We don't save people. The gospel does that. But God has ordained that in his infinite wisdom, we're the mouthpieces. Most people get saved not reading a tract. Now, I give out tracts regularly. You can ask my wife. I keep tracts in the car. I keep tracts on my person. I give them out. I know people that have been saved through a tract, and that's wonderful. We ought to do that. But most people aren't saved that way. They're saved because someone lived and told them the gospel. There was somebody in their life who was praying for them, who cared about them, who was willing to take their time to share the gospel with them. An evangelist that I have known for most of my life, who's in his 80s now, he said, the longer I live, the more convinced I am that the people that get saved in my meetings, somewhere, someone is praying for them. He said, I've tried to trace down what was their first contact with the gospel. What's behind this? And he said, often there was someone praying for them. A grandmother, a great aunt, a cousin, somebody. And often a mother and father. So God has chosen to use us as the vessels for the gospel. He doesn't go around us. He does it through us. So if people are going to be saved, we have to go. Romans chapter 10, and we won't go there today. We don't have time. But Paul says, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by what? The word of God. So every time we give out the powerful word from God, we're giving people the opportunity for life. We're giving people the opportunity to be right, to be righteous, to be viewed as righteous before God through Jesus Christ. But if we don't do that, it's not going to happen. Because God has ordained that it be that way. But in the end, I can't say it was me, it was the gospel. Paul says in Romans 8, but if the spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, lives in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead will also make alive your mortal bodies. Our resurrection depends on the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Our spiritual resurrection, being raised from the dead spiritually, to be alive with God, comes from the same power that resurrected Jesus Christ. Very interesting if you look at Acts and the Gospels, and you look at the events surrounding the crucifixion of Jesus, you see that there were a number of supernatural events that occurred. Rocks were rent. People rose from their graves and went into the city of Jerusalem. Very strange things happened. There was almost a sense of nature itself says something extremely unusual is happening. Something earth-shaking. Something that will divide time before Christ and after Christ. And that was the gospel. And Paul says in verse 5, but by whom we received grace and apostleship through obedience to the faith among all nations for his name. To be obedient is to submit to what God has said. God does not merely invite people to the gospel, he commands them to believe the gospel. So to not believe the gospel is to rebel against God. You say, well, wait a minute. There's some people who don't know. Well, let's see what Romans 1 says about that. We've already read verse 16, verse 17. Paul says to us, the righteous, for it is the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So the righteousness of God is revealed. It's made clear in the gospel. But notice with me the following verse. For the wrath of God is revealed. So in verse 17, as he talks to us about the gospel, he says it's by faith, and it's God's righteousness being revealed, and that righteousness is imputed to us through Jesus Christ. We're not really righteous, we're actually sinners, but God puts us in a new position. There are other places in Scripture that make it clear that it's a mathematical equation. It uses that symbolism. To be something to be imputed, to be put on your account. So I have sin, and Jesus has righteousness. He gives me his righteousness, and he gets my sin. So before the justice of God, sin has been cared for. Righteousness has been granted. Unrighteous people become righteous in God's eyes. And then in sanctification, righteousness begins to come in reality. And we're being made into the image of Jesus Christ, and that's someday going to be completed, not in this life, but at the rapture. I'm going to sin no more. The older I get, the more sinful I feel. I know how bad I am. And some of the dumb things I still do that displease God, I won't do anymore. Can you imagine that? The things that in my heart that displease God, I won't ever think those thoughts again. But for right now, I have the position of righteousness before God. And God is working in me his righteousness to make me more like him. So men need to obey the gospel. It's a command to believe. And those who believe are condemned, because he says in verse 17, the wrath of God is revealed. God's anger is also revealed in the gospel. And what that anger says is our sin makes God angry. Our sin, our disobedience, our excuses for not obeying God causes God to be prepared to judge us. In Romans 1:18-23, mankind is condemned as sinful because God has revealed himself and his eternal power in nature and in their conscience. Look at me with me at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. God says there is no one alive on this planet who can say, I didn't know God existed. There's no one on this planet who doesn't know there's a God who is all-powerful, who is the creator, who made everything, and to whom obviously they should be paying attention. Now, that won't save someone, but it moves in the direction of salvation. We have to have special revelation. But in natural revelation, everybody knows there's a God. You say, well, I know someone who's an atheist. They say they've never believed in God. They're lying. They have suppressed the truth. They've pushed it down. You ever try to hold a beach ball under water? What happens? It's going to come up somewhere. And all of us, before Christ, we suppress the truth. If there's a God, he's not that way. God loves everybody. Everybody's going to go to heaven. They'll eventually get there. We have our own ideas, and we're trying to suppress God's truth. But God says that truth cannot be completely eradicated. It's in your heart. Richard Dawkins is probably one of the most well-known atheists in our world today. He's about 75. He was professor, the chair of public science at Oxford University, and that was somebody who became an ambassador for science for the University of Oxford to the world, someone to talk about science, to encourage science. And so in the early 2000s, just after 9/11, there was a huge foment against religion because they felt like 9/11 was caused by religion. And so Richard Dawkins and three others, Sam Harris and a couple others, became what Christians called the Four Horsemen. Four Horsemen of atheism. And it really spread like fire across American campuses. And it sparked a whole series of debates. And men like Dawkins want to blame religion and belief in God for tragedy in this world. But the truth of the matter is, we are responsible for the tragedy in this world. Our sin is responsible for the tragedy in this world. Interesting that Dawkins has begun to slowly backpedal, because he said religion is the big problem in the world. So somebody in 2017 in a radio program asked him, if Christianity did not exist, would the world be better? And he said, I hate to admit it, but without Christianity, the world would be worse. And then in 2023, in a conversation, Richard Dawkins said, well, actually, I am a cultural Christian. They said, what does that mean? He said, well, I don't believe in God, but I love the hymns in the Anglican church at Christmas time. He said, they're so amazing, so beautiful, so uplifting. And he said, I enjoy that, but I don't believe in God. There's something in us that God put in us that tells us that there is a God, he's all powerful, and that automatically implies he's the boss. He's the creator. He's the one we should be looking to for what our life is about. But we suppress that knowledge with ungodliness and wickedness. The first word is not worshiping, literally. The second is not according to righteousness or unrighteousness or wickedness. So men and women suppress the truth that's inside of them and that they see out in nature. The Holy Spirit uses the testimony that's in our hearts, is in our conscience, and he uses the testimony of creation. Nobody can look at creation and say there's not a God. No, they can say it with their mouth, but they can't say it with their heart. Why? Because God says he has revealed it to them. They know. They may not want that knowledge. They might try to suppress that knowledge, but they know. A Christian apologist has a ministry on YouTube. You might have heard of him. Name slipped me somewhere here in my notes. But he was an atheist, and he came to Christ, and he wrote a book called God Doesn't Believe in Atheists. Let that one sink in. And he based it on this text. He based it on this text. We know. Everybody knows. Sometimes we look at people and say, well, you know, I don't think that guy really wants to hear the gospel. We may not want to hear it, but he knows there's a God. You have common ground with every person in this world because we all know God exists. Now, people will tell you, I don't believe in God. I don't want to hear that. That may be the case, but you know the truth. There's something in their heart that tells them that God exists. God has made the universe in such a way that we are responsible persons. All persons, not just those who have the Bible to guide them, have a moral conscience. If there are things that are right, there are things that are wrong. We know that intuitively because God put it in us. And later in Romans, Paul calls it the law that's in our hearts. Some people don't have the Mosaic law, but they've got the law that's in their heart. But because of their rejection of the truth, their suppression of the truth, their foolish hearts have become darkened. And what do? They create another kind of a God. They create a God for themselves that will be beneficial to them. And God calls that idolatry. Idolatry is not simply a piece of wood or a piece of metal that's molded into an image. Idolatry is what we put in the place of God. But in Romans it tells us in this passage that they began to make idols out of four-footed creatures and animals and human beings. They took the creation over the Creator. Everybody has a God. Everybody knows there is a God, and everybody has a God. The question is, what God do they have? Who is ruling their life? What are they worshiping? What do they most value? But Paul says when you suppress that knowledge, you become a fool. And you actually end up doing foolish things like bowing down to an idol that you made. Think about that. You make the idol, then you bow down and say, thank you for making me. Right? Idolatry is ridiculous. There's a new technology that's being used to look into jungle areas and be able to see what was there before. In Brazil, in the Amazon region, they did an experiment with LIDAR, like radar, but LIDAR is done with laser, and they fly over in a plane, and they can bounce these signals of laser, and it cuts through all the brush and the trees and the shrubbery, and it gives you just the lay of the land. And they've discovered that there are mounds and canals and streets and central areas, what you would call in Spanish a plaza, or in Portuguese a praça. Spanish did come from Portuguese, right? Never mind. A central plaza. Obviously places where people gathered and where sacrifices were made. And then out of that, spokes for several miles into the jungle where other small mounds were built. If you've ever been to southern Illinois, there's a place called Cahokia. And the Cahokia mounds are all over the southern United States. And that's where Indians actually took literally black dirt and took sacks of it and created mounds that are 60, 80 feet high. It's an unimaginable amount of work. And almost all anthropologists believe that it had to do with a community as well as religion. There was something that there was some kind of worship that was taking place in these places. There were places that obviously the chiefs lived and the medicine man lived. And this carries a similar culture into Latin America. The Aztecs built their pyramids. Brazilians built their mounds. They find them in Peru. They found them in Colombia with this LIDAR technology. So it tells us that they were what? An organized civilization. You say, well, how did they get naked running through the jungle? Because the society that man made was false worship. It was false gods. And idolatry will always lead to ignorance and destruction. And those societies collapsed. The Indians are not the pure, pristine, excellent form of humanity that we should all go back to. They are people who fled an organized civilization because it had destroyed itself. And for fear, scattered into small tribal groups all over the Amazon. You don't find a group of more than 200 or 300 Indians. Typically, they're in smaller villages. Why? Because they suppress the knowledge of God. Do they need the gospel? Absolutely. Can they be saved without the gospel? No. Do they know that God exists? Yes. They do. And because they've suppressed the truth, they absolutely need to know the one living and true God. And that's why Paul said, I'm separated to the gospel of God. My life is given to the gospel of God. Not all of us are called to be a full-time missionary. I get that privilege. You help me have that privilege. And I wouldn't trade that. But every Christian is called to speak the gospel. In fact, a word that's often used in the New Testament for preaching literally just has the idea of speaking or announcing. It doesn't have to be behind a pulpit. The idea is, I had a professor once that said it's like gossiping the gospel. It's our everyday conversations that we are proclaiming the gospel. Like heralds that would come into a city to announce the Roman emperor's news from village to village, city to city. And we're folks who give out the gospel. There are people who you can reach, who your pastor will absolutely never have an opportunity to reach. People that you work with, people you go to school with, people that are your neighbors, who might not even come to this church if you invited them. But you could do a home Bible study with them. You could give them the gospel. You can be a witness by your life. My father, 92 years old, still goes down every morning and has breakfast. When he lived in Illinois, he could go to a little local restaurant that had real food. Now he has to go to Hardee's. He lives in Florida. He moved to Florida with my sister a year ago, and it's too expensive to eat in real restaurants because it's a tourist town. So he has to go to Hardee's to have breakfast, and he has hash browns and all that good stuff. But he goes there to try to find somebody to witness to. And he's already talked to several of the workers. The manager knows him. He's already witnessed to her. And her son is having some real problems, and he said, bring him in and I'll talk to him. And just a couple of weeks ago, he gave a tract to one of the workers, and he said, I want you to take this home, and I want you to read it, and I want you, when you get done, read it again tomorrow. And then the next day, read it one more time, and then we can talk. He came back a couple of weeks ago, and he said to my dad, I read it. I got it. I think I'm ready. Dad said, well, you're on work time right now. But he said, we're going to talk to the manager and work out some time. So I don't know if that's happened yet. But my father has probably won more people to Christ than I have in my ministry, because he witnesses all the time. You can do that. If you're a Christian, you can do that. Because God's called all of us to proclaim his righteousness. A righteousness that we can have. Be right with God through Jesus Christ. The world is lost because they've suppressed the truth. But we should be truth revealers. We should be the kind of people who are getting the gospel out every opportunity God gives us. And I point fingers starting right here. This man needs to be better about giving out the gospel, about taking gospel opportunities, because it is the power of God unto salvation. Pastor?
Withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God shall stand forever. May God bless the preaching of his word. If you have questions about the gospel and about righteousness and wrath, I urge you to talk to myself or Pastor Tad. Don't go away from here questioning whether you're saved or not. Let us know, okay? We're glad to have the Alexanders with us. Ed and Jane, could you go ahead and go to the back? Kim, you want to show them where to stand? They have information back there at a table there in the fellowship hall. I encourage you to get to know them and be praying for them. We support them financially through our missions program. If you're not giving to our missions program, I encourage you to do so. We support them and several other missionaries around the world. But we also want to support them in prayer. And the Alexanders are the best at reporting to us of all of our missionaries. We get an update from them every week. And so we're thankful for that. All right, if you would stand, and then our music team will sing and dismiss us.
Let's close with singing the song Rescue the Perishing, a song about us going out and being gospel givers.
Rescue the perishing, the dying, living clearly of sin and we will hear God from the tower, and
Thankful for Pastor Tad. You can sit down.